An old woman, age 75 years, stood alone outside the palace gates in heavy rain. Her clothes were soaked, and she was shivering. She held a small notebook close to her chest, gripping it like it was the most important thing she had. Her face was wet with rain and tears, and she looked lost. A royal guard stood nearby, watching her. He wasn't supposed to move, his job was to stay still no matter what. But he couldn't ignore her. Something about the way she stood there, all alone, made him step forward. "Madam," he said in a calm voice, "are you okay?" The woman looked at him, her hands shaking. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, in a soft voice, she said, "I came here for my husband. This is where he proposed to me, many years ago." The guard listened, his usual stoic demeanor softening as she continued. "He was the love of my life," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "He wasn't just my husband. He was my strength, my best friend, the person who made everything in life feel better." She paused, her eyes welling up with fresh tears. "No matter how hard things got, he always knew how to make me smile." Her grip on the notebook tightened, and she looked at it for a moment before speaking again. "It's been 5 years since he passed away," she said. 5 long years. Not a single day goes by that I don't think about him." The guard stood silently, letting her speak. He could see the pain in her face, the deep sadness she had carried for so long. "Before he passed," she continued, her voice shaking, "he told me something. He said, when I'm gone, I want you to come back to the place where it all began. Go to the palace gates and remember the day I asked you to marry me. Remember how much I loved you, and don't forget to smile." She looked up at the guard, her wet hair sticking to her face. "But smiling, it's not so easy anymore." The guard felt a lump in his throat but stayed quiet, giving her space to share her story. "My children. They didn't understand," she said, shaking her head. "I told them I wanted to come here, to honor his memory, and they just laughed. They said I was being sentimental, that it wasn't worth the trip. Why go all the way to a palace gate just to think about the past? That's what they said." Her voice cracked as she spoke. "They didn't want to come with me. So, I came alone." Her body trembled, both from the cold and the weight of her emotions. "It wasn't just a trip to me," she said. "This was his last wish. The one thing he wanted me to do after he was gone. And I had to do it. Even if no one else understood." She opened the small notebook in her hands, revealing pages filled with faded handwriting. Her husband's handwriting. "This," she said, her fingers tracing the words, "is a collection of letters he wrote to me. Every year, on our anniversary, he'd write me a letter. Even after all these years, I kept them. They were his way of telling me how much he loved me, no matter what." She turned to a specific page, her hands shaking as she held it open. "This was the last one," she whispered. "I found it after he passed. He wrote it knowing he wouldn't be here to give it to me. In it, he asked me to come here, to this spot, and remember how much we meant to each other." Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the notebook to her chest. "He said to smile," she said, her voice barely audible now. "But how can I, when he's not here with me?" The guard's heart ached for her. He had seen many things during his time on duty, but this was different. Her pain, her love, her determination to fulfill her husband's last wish, it was something he couldn't ignore. The rain continued to pour, but the woman didn't seem to notice. All she had was the memory of her husband, and the guard could see how much she had carried alone. The guard stood silently, his usual stern expression softening with every word the elderly woman spoke. Her trembling hands, the heartbreak in her voice, and the love she still carried for her late husband struck a chord deep within him. He had been trained to remain stoic, to never show emotion, and to follow orders without question. But in that moment, none of it mattered. She wasn't just a stranger. She was someone in pain, and he couldn't ignore it. As the rain continued to pour, he took a slow, deliberate step closer to her. Without a word, he reached up and unclipped his ceremonial red coat. The fabric, heavy with rain, still offered warmth. He gently draped it over her frail shoulders, shielding her from the cold. The woman looked up, startled. "Oh, no," she said, shaking her head weakly. "I can't take this. You'll get in trouble." "Let me worry about that," he replied softly, his voice steady but kind. "You need it more than I do." She hesitated, her fingers brushing over the rich fabric of the coat. It wasn't just the warmth she felt, it was the kindness behind the gesture. Her lips quivered as she whispered, "Thank you." The guard offered his arm, bending slightly so she could reach it. "Come with me," he said gently. The woman blinked, confused. "But I can't go in. This is as far as I'm allowed." He gave her a small, reassuring nod. "Not today." With careful steps, he led her through the gates. The sound of the rain softened as they moved under the shelter of the palace courtyard. The cobblestone path glistened with puddles, and the faint scent of wet earth filled the air. The woman walked slowly, leaning on his arm for support. Her grip was light but shaky, as if she couldn't believe this was happening. "I haven't been inside these gates since," she paused, her voice catching. "Since the day he asked me to marry him. It was raining then, too. He always joked that the rain was lucky for us." The guard didn't respond, letting her words fill the quiet space between them. She continued, her voice growing steadier as they walked. "He loved me so much. Every day, he made me feel like I was the most important person in the world. Even when times were hard, he always found a way to make me smile." They stopped at a small stone bench near the gardens. The guard gestured toward it, helping her sit. He stood back, giving her a moment. She looked around, her eyes scanning the space until they landed on a spot just ahead. "This is it," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "This is where it happened." She smiled, though it trembled. "It feels like he's here." The guard nodded silently, his heart heavy yet full. For the first time in his career, he wasn't just a symbol of duty. He was a human being offering comfort in someone's darkest moment. The woman stood still, her eyes fixed on the spot where her husband had knelt all those years ago. The rain poured steadily around her, but she didn't notice. Her mind was filled with memories, vivid and alive, as if the past had come rushing back to her. She reached out as if to touch something invisible, her fingers trembling. The guard stood a few steps behind her, silent and watchful, respecting the moment. His ceremonial coat still draped over her shoulders, giving her warmth against the cold rain. He had never seen such raw emotion before, and it left him unsure of what to do, except to stay and let her have this moment. She closed her eyes, her lips quivering as she whispered, "It feels like he's here with me." Her voice, though quiet, carried a weight that made the air around them feel heavier. She inhaled deeply, the scent of rain and wet earth mingling with the flood of memories. For a brief moment it was as if her husband's presence surrounded her, comforting her, holding her as he once had. Her hands, still clutching the small notebook, moved slowly to open it. The guard watched as she carefully flipped through the pages, the delicate handwriting preserved on each one. Her fingers stopped at a specific page, and she gently wiped away the raindrops that had landed on it. "This," she said softly, turning slightly toward the guard, her voice breaking, "is the last letter he wrote to me. I found it after he was gone. He knew he wouldn't be here to give it to me." Her voice faltered as she began to read aloud, her tears mixing with the rain that streamed down her face. "My dearest love," she began, her voice trembling. "If you're reading this, it means I'm not there with you. But I need you to know that I'll always be with you, no matter what." She paused, her breath hitching as she tried to hold back her sobs. The guard took a step closer but said nothing, his expression soft with empathy. "I want you to go to the palace gates," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stand where we began, where I asked you to be mine forever. Remember that day, and remember how much I loved you. And promise me one thing, smile, my love. Smile for me, even when it's hard." The notebook trembled in her hands as her tears fell freely now. She looked up at the spot again, her face both grief-stricken and at peace. For the first time in years, she let herself smile, a small, bittersweet smile that spoke of both love and loss. "Thank you," she said, turning to the guard. Her voice was steady now, filled with gratitude. "Thank you for letting me feel this again." The guard nodded, his own emotions held tightly in check. The rain continued to fall, but in that moment, it felt as though the world had stilled, leaving only the memory of love and a woman's quiet courage to honor it. The elderly woman stood quietly for a few moments longer, the rain continuing to fall around her. Her frail shoulders were still draped in the royal guard ceremonial coat, its bright red now darkened by the downpour. She stared at the spot where her husband had knelt decades ago, her lips forming a faint, bittersweet smile. It was as if, for a brief moment, the years melted away, and she was back in that memory, young and in love. The guard stood a few steps back, watching silently. His usual stoic expression softened as he observed the peace that had settled over her. He didn't need to say anything, his presence alone was enough. In his years of service, he had stood through countless ceremonies and traditions, but this act, breaking protocol to help this woman, felt more meaningful than anything else he'd done. As the rain began to lighten, a few passers-by noticed the unusual scene. They saw the woman standing at the gates, her frail figure leaning slightly on the guard's arm earlier, and the kindness he had shown her. Some whispered to each other, while others stopped to watch, their expressions filled with quiet awe. It wasn't every day they saw a royal guard step out of formation, let alone show such a deeply human side. The woman turned back toward the guard, her eyes shimmering with a mix of tears and gratitude. She adjusted the coat on her shoulders, her hands trembling as she tried to find the right words. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. "You've given me more than help today, you've brought him back to me. For a moment, I could feel him here. I could remember everything." The guard's posture straightened slightly, but he gave her a small nod. "It was my honor, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. He had been trained to be a symbol of discipline and duty, but in that moment, he was simply a man offering kindness. She smiled, her eyes still glistening. He would have loved this. He always believed in small acts of kindness. He said they were what kept the world going. The guard stepped forward and gently took back his coat, shaking off the water before folding it over his arm. As he did, she placed her hand on his briefly, her touch light but meaningful. "You've reminded me that kindness still exists, even in a world that feels so cold sometimes," she said. As she prepared to leave, the woman took one last look at the gates and the spot where her husband had proposed. She straightened her shoulders and smiled, a small but brave gesture. The guard watched as she walked away, her steps slow but purposeful. He returned to his post, standing tall once again. But as he resumed his watch, he couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted. The moment lingered in his mind, a quiet reminder that even the smallest acts of compassion could leave an everlasting impact. The rain slowed, the world continued, but the memory of that day stayed with him forever. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We'll continue bringing you more heartfelt stories that remind us of the beauty of kindness and the connections that make life meaningful. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.